Good morning.
Good morning, Your
Ms.
Honour.
Ward.
Your Honour, today is day 2 of the stage 2 case studies into cause and origin investigations arising from the 2019-2020 bushfire season. The focus of the evidence today is largely upon investigations by the Rural Fire Service and their authorised fire investigators. And that will take place by way of 2 case study fires. A case study relating to the Mount McKenzie Road Tenterfield fire and a case study relating to the Gross Valley fire. I think there is at least one addition to the appearances that were made yesterday, day 1 Creewar fire, which is a person appearing on screen. So before I say anything more, I should allow people to update their appearances.
Yes, thank you.
For the purpose of today's hearing.
Any new appearances today?
My name is Ransom and I'm here on behalf of IAG.
I'm sorry, I just missed the beginning.
Oh, my name is Ransom and
Yes,
I'm
Ms.
here
Ransom.
on behalf of IAG. Thank you.
IAG. Thanks very much.
Your Honour, in terms of the witnesses who will be giving evidence today, Your Honour will firstly hear from Detective Sergeant Harvey, who is the officer in charge of the Gross Valley Fire Investigation and Coronial Inquiry Brief. And then Your Honour will hear concurrent evidence from Ben Millington, the Assistant Commissioner for State Operations at the Rural Fire Service. Mr Millington will give evidence from the courtroom. And simultaneously, Mr Mark Fulliger, the Training Coordinator of the Fire Investigation and Compliance Unit of the Rural Fire Service, will give evidence, but he'll be appearing by screen.
Thank you.
So I call Your Honour Laura Harvey.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Have a seat. Thank you, Detective Sergeant. And if you'd like to take your mask off, you're most welcome to.
Thank you.
Can you see me over that computer screen?
Yes.
All right. Would you state your full name, rank and station?
Laura Jane Harvey, Detective Sergeant, Hawkesbury Police Area Command.
Are you the officer in charge of the coronial investigation into the fire known as the Gross Valley Fire, Mount Wilson?
Yes.
In that capacity, have you previously provided a statement to assist Her Honour's inquiry and attended court during the hearings in Katoomba Local Court earlier this year to give further evidence?
Yes.
Since that time, have you provided a further statement dated the 25th of August 2022?
Yes, I have.
Do you have a copy of that statement and its annexures with you?
Yes, I do.
Is there anything within the statement that requires correction?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are the contents of the statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
I'm going to ask you some questions today about your efforts to have either New South Wales Police or the Rural Fire Service conduct a cause and origin investigation into the scene of ignition for the fire that commenced to the east of Mount Wilson Road on the 14th of December 2015. Do you follow?
Yes.
Firstly, Detective Sergeant, do you recall when the police investigation into this fire was first allocated to you?
I don't remember the exact dates, no, but it was soon after the fire began to burn down Belzina Road.
And when you say soon after, are we talking days rather than weeks?
Yes, days.
At the time that the police investigation into the fire was allocated to you, was a rural fire service scene investigation already in train to your knowledge?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
At the time that the fire was allocated to you as officer in charge, was a rural fire service scene investigation or plan to go out and investigate the cause and origin of the fire?
Not that I'm...
Already, just let me finish, already in train or already being planned to your knowledge?
No.
And what about from a police forensic evidence and technical services command perspective? Were you aware of any FETS scene investigation being in train as at the time the fire was allocated to you for investigation?
Not yet, no.
At the time that the fire was allocated to you for investigation, was there a Strikeforce Toronto officer assigned to the fire in a kind of liaison role between you and the Rural Fire Service?
Yes.
Who was that?
Initially, it was Detective Sergeant Kanza, and then I was allocated another senior constable whose name I can't recall at the moment.
Do you recall when it was that the allocation changed from Detective Sergeant Kanza to another officer?
Would have only been about a week later, I was advised.
So perhaps still in 2019?
I don't recall the date, I'm sorry, I can't tell you.
And what did you understand their role to be?
They were assisting me in any inquiries that I might have or assistance in relation to corresponding with the RFS, any questions I had in relation to my brief that I was to prepare for the investigation and any tasks that I should be completing.
Is it fair to say they were there as a resource that you could draw upon if you needed guidance from someone who might have particular expertise in arson investigations?
Yes, that's right.
Did you understand that they also had a role in being a conduit between you as the OIC and the Rural Fire Service if you needed the Rural Fire Service to assist you in the preparation of a brief?
Yes.
Were you also, as far as you were aware, also entitled to contact the RFS directly yourself rather than going through the team with Strikeforce Toronto?
Yes, that's right.
I'm going to ask you to turn up some of the correspondence that's annexed to your most recent statement. Does your version have red page numbers in the bottom right-hand corner? Using that version, could you turn up page 3485, please? And for those following electronically, this is the Gross Valley Fire Brief of Evidence, Volume 11. And, Your Honour, within the hard copy, Volume 11, tab 72.
Thank you.
Then behind tab 72, Your Honour, I'm taking the witness to page 3485.
Thank you.
Do you have that page, Sergeant? Thank you. Do you see there an email that you apparently sent on Monday the 23rd of December 2019 addressed to fire investigation at the Rural Fire Service?
Yes.
Was this your first contact with the Rural Fire Service in relation to this investigation?
Yes.
The subject line reads gross fire. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Was this fire already known by this name as at the 23rd of December 2019?
Yes, it was.
Why did I withdraw that. Do you know who gave the fire that name, Gross Fire?
No, I don't. I can't recall how they were named. No,
It wasn't you though, is that
no,
right?
it's not me.
Why did you direct this particular email to Fire Investigation rather than send it via Strikeforce Toronto?
I'd been given this contact email address by another colleague that had been initially dealing with some early correspondence. After I came back from leave, I took over the correspondence. So I've emailed the address that I was given for the RFS to start getting some information as soon as possible.
Right. In this email, you asked for someone to contact you as soon as possible in relation to the out-of-control backburn fire, either started in Mount Wilson or Bilpin, 14 to 15 December.
Yes.
What in particular did you want to discuss with the RFS at this point?
Mostly a liaison that I could get information from in relation to the start of the fire and anybody I could speak to get some data and just to have a liaison.
You wanted a liaison to get information about the start of the fire and then some data, is that right?
Yes.
What sort of data were you thinking of?
In relation to the time, date, place of the initial backburn, to confirm those details. And given that it was sometime later, it was the first day of the fire, I believe, was the 14th of December. So by the 23rd of December, it was well on its way. So in relation to property losses and who I could speak to in relation to any damage and the brigades involved.
Did you have in your mind at this time that you might also request the Rural Fire Service to conduct an investigation into the scene where the fire was believed to have commenced?
Yes, I would have been asking all of those initial questions as to who could tell me the best person to speak to arrange those sorts of inquiries.
Did you also contact New South Wales Police, FETS, separately to request an investigation to be conducted by that command?
Yes.
And how did you do that?
I spoke to the coordinators at crime scene, firstly to find out how to organise the scene examination, and we had to send police to each destroyed structure and property, and I needed to find out how to go about doing that and who would be allocated to me.
Does that mean FETS's role was to extend beyond an investigation of origin, point of origin for the fire, and extend into that attempt to investigate properties and structures damaged by the fire?
Correct.
Could you turn to page 3489? Do you have there, Detective Sergeant, an email that you seem to have sent to Andrew Brady on the 14th of January 2020? Yes. Was Andrew Brady then a police officer with the FETS command?
Yes.
Right. You seem to be reporting to him in this email that you were still waiting for a scene examination at two ignition points for two different fires. Is that a fair summary?
That's right.
And in terms of the Gross Valley fire, you provided the detail that you were waiting for an examination or something was still outstanding in terms of an ignition point, corner of Mount Wilson Road and the Bells line of road, Mount Tomah.
That's right.
Why did you feel it was important to include that detail?
I was still unaware that it had taken place. I was aware that the scene had to be examined and mindful of the time that now being in January that it still needed to be examined.
Right. Can you come then to page 3488? So it's just the page before. Do you have that there?
Yes, I have that.
Now, this is not your document, but I just want you to tell the court whether you confirm with this interpretation, if you confirm or agree with this interpretation. Andrew Brady, who you had contacted, then sent an email to someone called Gregory Moon, passing on those details.
That's right.
You were CC'd in that chain,
Yes.
and what Andrew Brady does is pass on again details of outstanding wildfires to be examined, including a reference to One Gross Valley Fire, corner of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road, Mount Tomah.
That's right.
Is Gregory Moon another officer with New South Wales Police Vets, to your knowledge?
Yes, he is.
Then if we could come please to page 3492.
I have that.
All right. You've included in your statement here an email from someone called Susan, I'm not sure how to pronounce her surname, maybe Guiama. Is she a police officer with New South Wales Vets?
She's a coordinator. That's right. She's a police officer with vets.
And she seems to have passed on to the Rural Fire Service, to Cheryl Cook at that organisation, details about outstanding wildfires to be examined. Do you agree with that interpretation?
Yes.
And again, has included the detail of the scene that you wanted to have examined for the One Gross Valley fire.
That's right.
This email has a suggestion towards the bottom of the email that someone called Senior Constable Andrews might be available on Friday the 17th of January.
That's right.
Do you agree with that interpretation?
Yes.
Then if we come to the page before, page 3491, do you see at the top of the page, you've included another statement from the Detective Senior, sorry, I withdraw that, another email from Detective Senior Sergeant, I don't even know how to start, Gema. If someone wants to correct my pronunciations, now's the point, because I can see Mr. Free laughing at me at the table.
Is this Susan's name?
Susan, let's call her Detective Senior Sergeant Susan.
Gilmire.
Gilmire, thank you. And again to Ms. Cook at the Rural Fire Service, but other recipients at New South Wales Police. Again, providing the area where you wanted the One Gross Valley fire scene examination conducted. But if we move down through this email, it looks like at this point that the investigation might have moved to Monday the 20th of January.
That's right.
And then, Senior Sergeant, if you come to the page before that, page 3490, you've included an email in the middle of that page from Sarah Southall.
That's right.
She's also New South Wales Police, Forensic Evidence and Technical Services Command, is that right? And again, this is an email that you were not included in at the time that it was sent, is that right? When did you become aware of this email?
When it was provided to me prior to completing this statement.
So this year, 2022? Thank you. It seems that at some point, tell me if this is a fair interpretation of what you've annexed, at some point between the email on 17 January suggesting that an investigation might take place on Monday the 20th of January at the corner of Mount Wilson Road and Bell's Line of Road, there's been a change in plan and there's a question as to whether or not an investigation will go ahead.
That's right.
Did anyone, either from New South Wales Police or the Rural Fire Service, consult you about the possibility that an investigation into the scene of the Gross Valley fire might not go ahead?
No, I wasn't informed of any of that.
Did anyone at either New South Wales Police or the Rural Fire Service consult you about a possibility that an investigation would go ahead, but at a scene different to the scene that you had asked for?
No.
The court knows that ultimately the investigation of the scene for the Gross Valley fire focused upon an attempt to determine the point where the fire crossed from one local government area into another local government area as it moved across the Gross River. You're aware of that? That's the examination that was ultimately conducted?
Yes, I am.
When did you learn that the scene that was ultimately investigated was the suspected point where the fire crossed the Gross River?
I had a conversation, I sent an email, I believe, to ask vets if the examination had been conducted and who went. And then I contacted Neil Welshinger via email.
Neil Welshinger is from FETS.
Yes.
Go on.
And he replied to me in a short email that they had attended on the 20, was it the, I've got an email here, I believe with the date on it, that they'd met at the Blue Mountains Fire Control Centre and attended an area I wasn't familiar with. At first I didn't recognise that it wasn't the bushland near Mount Wilson, and that they determined it was a spot over from the Gospers mountain fire.
In terms of that email from Detective Sergeant Welshinger, is that an email that you've included at page 3497?
Yes, that's the reply from Sergeant Welshinger at the bottom.
And this would demonstrate, would it not, that it was the 30th of January 2020 was the time at which you were advised that the scene investigation had taken place at a scene other than the scene you had asked them to attend?
That's right.
Now, at that point, did you give any consideration to pursuing a request to FETS or FETS or the Rural Fire Service that they should attempt to investigate the scene that you had nominated?
Yes, a couple of days later after that conversation, when I tried to make some initial inquiries, I believe I might have emailed Cheryl Cook from the RFS investigation team and had a phone call with Neil, Sergeant Welshinger, and discussed why that might have occurred in the wrong place, and I would like it to be re-examined where I'd requested. And we discussed how I might initiate that, and it wouldn't be through Neil not being a coordinator at that point in time. So I've had some conversations with my colleagues at work about the best way to go about having this revisited. I'd spoke to Cheryl about it at that point, and I believe she might have responded that the report hadn't been compiled yet.
Well, just let me stop you there. In terms of your conversations with Cheryl Cook, are they the matters that are set out within the emails that you've annexed between you and Ms. Cook to your statement?
Yes, I believe they're contained in my statement.
And you were, is it fair to say, frustrated that a scene investigation had not taken place at the point that you had asked for it to be conducted?
I was frustrated, yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Detective Sergeant, but I don't think anywhere within the email chain that you've annexed between you and Cheryl Cook do you go so far as to ask for there to be another cause and origin investigation to be conducted?
My only request was if I could speak to the investigator or if I could have access to a report, or why was the fire deemed to be a spot over from the Gospers fire.
And is it fair to say that there was then a delay before you received a copy of the actual report resulting from the scene investigation for the Gross Valley fire?
Yes.
You were frustrated by that delay?
Somewhat, yes.
And is it fair to say you were also frustrated by the fact that it didn't take place at the scene that you had requested? Yes. If you had been asked back in January of 2020 about whether it would be useful for a cause and origin investigation to extend to and include a review of the scene where the fire was believed to have left one LGA and entered the Blue Mountains LGA, what would your response have been?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
If you had been asked in January of 2020 whether you would be assisted or whether it would be useful to your investigation for the cause and origin scene investigation to, in addition to the point you've identified, include a second scene, being the scene where the fire is believed to have crossed the river from one LGA into another, what would your response have been?
I don't think it would have assisted greatly, no.
If you had been advised of a position or a decision that the only scene that would be investigated for the cause and origin of the fire known as the Gross River fire or the Gross Valley fire was going to be at that point where the fire is believed to have crossed from one LGA into another, what would you have said in response to that position?
If the examination was going to be conducted where I'd requested.
No, withdraw that and I'll start again. If you'd been told in advance, we're only going to go to one scene and we've decided to go to the scene where the fire crossed the river and spread from one LGA into another, what would your response have been?
It's not helpful as to the cause and origin of where the fire was believed to have occurred.
Ultimately, you did not pursue a further investigation through FETS or the RFS asking them to attend the scene that you'd first identified?
That's right.
Why is that?
I believed that at that point in time it would have been fruitless given the time lapse, and also information that I'd received. I was satisfied as to the cause and origin of the fire. It was well documented at that point that there was a backburn that occurred on the 14th of December. The New South Wales RFS were assisting with my investigation. I was receiving information and eventually statements that would compile my reason for my satisfaction for the cause and origin of that fire.
Tell me if this is fair. There came a point in time when the RFS were providing enough statements, investigation reports and other material relevant to the cause and origin of the fire that you became confident that the cause and origin could be understood on the basis of that material without needing to proceed to a specific scene investigation at the point that you had earlier identified. Your Honour, those are my questions for this witness.
Thank you. Mr. Free?
Just a couple of short matters, if I could, Your Honour. So, Detective Sergeant, you ultimately received 2 investigation reports from the RFS relating to this fire. Is that right?
a report from Darren Howe and
Yes.
a report from Matthew O'Donnell.
Yes, okay. And you, in fact, received those within a matter of days of each other, one at the end of July and the other in the first week of August.
If that's correct, yes.
I can take you to your statement if you...
No, that's fine.
Yep. And the report of Mr O'Donnell was an investigation that was specifically about the site you were interested in,
That's correct.
and you in fact used that to base a number of your conclusions.
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Ms. Ransom?
No questions from me. Thank you.
Ms. Rose? No, Your Honour. Thank you.
I think there's also an appearance today by Ms. Wilkinson.
Ms. Wilkinson, sorry, I can't see your name.
Not on screen at the moment, but...
Oh, sorry, Your Honour, it's Ms.
Oh, there you are.
No, there's no questions from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Detective Sergeant. You're excused.
Your Honour, the next witnesses will be Ben Millington. If Mr. Millington can come up to the witness box. And Mr. Fulliger has been waiting in the virtual waiting room, so we'll have him brought online as well.
Mr. Fulliger, can you see and hear us in the courtroom?
I can.
Thanks for making yourself available. You just hear from the court officer now.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do. I do.
Thank you. It's from Mr. Fulliger and Mr. Millington. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Mr. Millington, firstly, would you state your name, occupation and employment address?
Ben Millington, Assistant Commissioner with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and 4 Murray Rose Avenue, Sydney Olympic Park.
Mr. Millington, is your substantive role as Assistant Commissioner particularly in the area of state operations for the Rural Fire Service?
That is correct.
And what role did you have in the 2019-2020 bushfire season?
Between October and December, I was the Manager State Operations, and then from late December until now, the Director of State Operations.
Mr. Fulliger, would you state your name, occupation and employment address?
Yes, Mark Fulliger, Training Coordinator, Fire Investigation and Compliance Unit, and Authorised Fire Investigator, 4 Murray Rose Avenue, Sydney Olympic Park.
Mr. Fulliger, what role did you have during the 2019-2020 bushfire season for the RFS?
Numerous roles during that season, from FI coordination to being deployed into the field as a fire investigator, strike team coordinator and response team coordinator.
Were you in the position of training coordinator, your current position, back in 2019-2020?
That's correct, yes.
What I propose to do today, gentlemen, is ask a series of questions. I will try and direct them at one or other of you particularly, but if you feel that each of you have something that you can contribute to Her Honour on a topic that I haven't covered with you, please speak up. It will be quite difficult, though, to make sure that we get everyone on the transcript clearly, given that we've got one person via AVL and one person in the courtroom. So it'll just be important that we don't speak over each other. All right. The first set of questions are on the topic of fire investigation resources available for the RFS. And in particular, I think these questions will firstly be directed to Mr. Fulliger, because it's going into the details of the authorised fire investigators that your organisation uses. But again, Mr. Millington, if you have something to add, speak up. Mr. Fulliger, as at the 2019-2020 bushfire season, can you give an approximate number of how many authorised fire investigators there were with your service?
Yeah, I think it was from 1st of July. I think we had approximately 130 authorised fire investigators.
Of that 130, how many were available to conduct cause and origin investigation in the fires that actually took place across that season?
We didn't keep track of who was available. When requests went out for availability, the maximum number of FIs that made themselves available was 10 at any one time.
Tell me if this is a fair summary. A call would come in for a cause and origin investigation to be undertaken. Someone within your organisation would contact the authorised fire investigators to see who might be available, and the maximum number of replies you got on any fire across that season was from 10 authorised fire investigators. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Is that a surprisingly small number to you?
Yes, it is, but considering the season that we had, that didn't surprise us.
So in context of the season, what was it about the season that meant it was not surprising in context?
Just the amount of fire that was on the ground, and staff and volunteers being used in other roles. Obviously, volunteers, fire investigators have roles within their brigades as firefighters, sector leaders, DivCom, so they're being utilised in those areas.
So people who are already busy fighting fires in other capacities?
That's correct.
Across that season, were the 130 authorised fire investigators a mix of both volunteer and salaried officers?
That's correct, yes.
Can you give us a rough ratio of how many were volunteer and how many salaried?
For that period, I can't. I don't have those figures, but currently it's 60 volunteers, 46 staff.
Right, you're quite precise there, 60 and 46. Does that mean there's presently 106 authorised fire investigators?
At this point in time, there is 106 now, yes.
So that's quite a decrease in comparison to the 130 that were available only 3 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Is there anything that you can attribute that decrease to?
I think the fire season, people retiring, not wanting to undertake fire investigation any further.
Potentially COVID impact?
Potentially COVID, yes.
Of the 130 authorised fire investigators back in 2019, 2020, were any of them employed as full-time authorised fire investigators dedicated to that role?
No.
What about currently?
No, there's not.
Did that reflect the fact that in a so-called typical year, the Rural Fire Service is not conducting enough investigations to warrant full-time fire investigator positions?
I really can't answer that question.
Mr. Millington, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, so historically the fire investigation unit has relied largely on volunteers who have been trained in that field, supplemented by salaried officers. I think we've seen that 2019-20 season and with obviously research to date that our fire seasons are becoming longer and more severe and intense. The fire investigation unit historically consisted of 2 officers. They weren't dedicated fire investigators. They largely oversaw training and intelligence matters and liaison with police. That team has increased to 4 dedicated officers. again, none of those are solely for fire investigation purposes, but that's certainly something that, given what happened in the 1920 season, as well as the research that's come to light to date, is probably the natural progression for the service to go down that path.
Her Honour heard some evidence yesterday from Detective Chief Inspector Puffett of the New South Wales Arson Unit talking about the need to sort of future-proof his organisation in recognition of the fact that fire seasons, as you've just said, Mr Millington, are likely to become longer and more dangerous. And that seems to be the sort of thing that you're picking up on as well, with a long-term eye to future-proofing the RFS in recognition of the fact that there may be increased demand for authorised fire investigations in times to come.
Most definitely.
How do you do that?
Look, I think there's a number of ways. The training course itself has recently been reviewed in line with the national competency standards. So I think there's ways in which training is delivered to make that more accessible and flexible so that more volunteers can undertake that. But I think in terms of dedicated fire investigators to ensure availability, more specialist skills potentially, that the RFS certainly does need, as you said, to fireproof ourselves down the track by having dedicated officers in place.
One of the consequences, though, of bushfire seasons becoming longer and more severe is that there will also be a need to future-proof the RFS in terms of your ability to fight fires in the field, to model fire prediction analysis. The need to future-proof is not limited to future-proofing authorised fire investigators.
No, and I think the State Bushfire Inquiry undertaken by former Deputy Police Commissioner Dave Owens and Chief Scientist Mary O'Kane highlighted some of those areas in which, you know, the service is currently addressing to ensure we have those capabilities addressed, you know, for future seasons where we see that increased in fire activity. But I think to Mark's point as well, volunteers and staff also perform other roles, whether that's in incident management, out on the fire appliance, fighting fires. Fire investigation just forms one of those roles or support roles that they perform. So there definitely is a need for us to continue to explore that option.
This is a question that either of you can respond to. Am I right in understanding that the Fire Investigation Service Standard 3.1.9 that was in force as at the time of the 2019-2020 season was version 2 of that document dating back to 2009. And if you want us to bring it up on the screen, we can do that so that you can check those dates. Does that sound about right, Mr. Millington?
I'll defer to Mark in terms of that.
All right. What we'll do is we'll have this document, Mr. Fulliger, the standard, not a standard operating procedure, what's it called?
Service standard.
The Service Standard 3.1.9 seems to deal with fire investigation. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the version of that service standard in force as at season 2019-2020 was version 2?
That's correct, yes.
Which dates back to 2009.
That's correct.
That's since been amended, hasn't it?
That has, yes. And version 3 of April 2021.
Well, the first thing I'll do is ask some questions about the version that was in force as at the time of the 2019-2020 season. And if we can bring it up in court, we will, and if we can't, we'll muddle through. But for the benefit of those at the bar table, I'm going to take the witnesses now to volume 11 of the General Brief of Evidence, and it's tab 37. And in particular, it'll be page 3971. Mr. Fulliger, can you see that document well enough on the screen in front of you?
Yes, I can. I've also got it on my iPad, so.
Very well. Okay. This document seems to set out procedures at point 2 for the conduct of investigations into fire cause, including the role of the senior officer of the first responding crew, which is identified in paragraph 2.1. Is that right, Mr. Fulliger?
That's correct, yes.
Does that mean that at some smaller fires, it might be the case that the senior officer of the first responding crew forms an opinion as to likely cause and no further fire investigation is required by the organisation?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
If fire cause is not apparent to the senior officer, or the fire fits within one of the criteria then set out in 2.2, is the fire then referred to the fire investigation unit within the RFS?
It will be flagged for fire investigation.
Thank you. The criteria that are set out at 2.2 include criteria relating to bushfires, but seem to extend to other sorts of fires as well. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes.
For instance, there's a reference at 2.2G to structural fires.
That's correct, yes.
In 2019-2020, were RFS authorised fire investigators authorised to investigate all types of fires, or could they be accredited just for bushfires or just for structural fires or something of the like?
They can be accredited for both or individually for wildfire and or structural.
And was it very common in 2019-2020 for those authorised fire investigators to be authorised only for structural, not for wildfire?
Yes, we have, I think, 6 that are only structural qualified.
So out of the 130 AFIs that you said were available for that year, should we remove the 6 that were possibly only authorised for structural fires at that time?
Yes, you could.
And what about currently? Is the situation the same, that authorised fire investigators can be authorised just for structural or just for wildfire?
At the moment, yes.
What's the current take-up in terms of AFIs being authorised for both types of fires?
There are still the 6 that are structural only.
Yes.
And not sure of the actual figures of who is qualified in both and only in wildfire.
Well, in any event, the vast majority of currently authorised fire investigators are authorised to conduct wildfire investigations. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Mr. Millington, do you have anything to add on this, or do we defer to Mr. Fulliger's detailed experience? There have been a number of fires that Her Honour has inquired into across this season that did not receive a Rural Fire Service scene investigation, even though they might appear to meet one or more of the criteria set out at 2.2 of that document. Would it be fair to say that the authorised fire investigator resources didn't stretch to investigate all of the fires in the 2019-2020 season that were caught within the 2.2 criteria?
Yes, that would be correct, yes.
Did that mean, Mr. Fulliger, that you or someone else in the organisation had to prioritise which fires would receive an authorised fire investigator review?
That's correct.
Just bear with me, gentlemen. Her Honour has received a letter on behalf of the Rural Fire Service, and I'll see if it can be brought up on screen. It's from, I think it's volume 7 of the General Brief of Evidence, tab 32, page 2595. Just bear with us, Mr. Fulliger, we'll bring that up on screen. Volume 7, tab 32, page 2595. All right, can you see that well enough?
Yes, I can.
If you can't, I'm going to take you to the important parts. In this letter, the RFS spoke about priority being given to incidents involving fatalities, significant property loss, and those fires resulting in Section 44 declarations. Were they the priorities, Mr. Millington or Mr. Fulliger, that were used to determine which fires would receive an authorised fire investigator investigation of the likely scene of origin?
I'll answer that. Yes, that is correct.
It seems, though, according to this letter, some Section 44 fires underwent a desktop investigation rather than a physical scene examination. So even for those fires that were significant enough to be subject to a declaration under the Rural Fires Act, there was not sufficient authorised fire investigation resources to permit an investigation of the scene for all of those fires. Is that fair to say?
There was probably a number of reasons why that didn't occur. So
Yes.
whilst it was a Section 44 declaration, there may have not been a fatality recorded or significant property loss. So whilst the fire was declared for the purposes of coordination, other criteria may have been imposed at the time simply because of a prioritisation lens.
Again, I'm going to come back to this so-called normal fire year, and what I just mean is a year different to 2019, 2020. In a year like that, is it very common for there to be Section 44 declarations for particular fires where those fires do not receive a cause and origin investigation of the scene?
No, in normal seasons, as you refer to, Section 44 fires are subject to a cause and origin investigation.
When the RFS is talking about fire investigations, what does that mean for the purposes of the organisation?
In what respect? Sorry.
Well, if the RFS is sending someone out to conduct a fire investigation, what are you expecting them to investigate?
Look, I'll also defer to Mark, but in summary, we're looking for the cause and origin. So what caused the fire and where did the fire start?
Mr. Fulliger?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
So even though you do not carry the responsibility that New South Wales Police have to ultimately report certain fires to the coroner and conduct an investigation into cause and origin of certain fires, cause and origin is still what you are interested in when one of your AFIs, goes out to investigate a scene. Is that fair to say, Mr. Fulliger?
That's correct, yes.
Mr. Millington, do you have any reason to disagree with that?
No.
Coming back then to the AFIs available in 2019, Mr. Fulliger, were they spread around the state in each of the Rural Fire Service fire districts?
That's correct, yes.
And are they still?
Yes, they are.
Are there any districts presently where you do not have authorised fire investigators available, so you have to borrow from other places?
Yes, we do.
how do you, I'll withdraw that. The aim though, isn't it, is for each of those districts to be self-sufficient or independently able to provide an authorised fire investigator to review fires within that locale?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Has anyone been able to or turned their mind to looking at the figures to attempt to estimate the number of fire investigations actually conducted by the organisation across that unprecedented fire season?
I'd have to take that on notice. There was a lot of work done in terms of reviewing the number of fires that occurred that season, but in terms of the actual number of investigations, I'm not aware of a specific figure.
Mr. Fulliger, are you aware of a specific figure?
I did get those figures out, but it was not in the pack that was sent to me yesterday. So yeah, it's not here, but I did get those figures out when I was last in at work.
Okay. We know that we've had to make different arrangements for your evidence today, but is it possible that we could get those figures in due course?
Certainly.
Thank you. You've told the court this morning, Mr. Fulliger, that when calling for authorised fire investigators during the season, the most number of responses you got on any given fire was 10. I just want to explore with you, of the reports that were actually conducted across that season, were they spread across the over 100 AFIs then authorised, or did they tend to concentrate in the hands of some of your most experienced or most available investigators?
There was probably half a dozen to 10 FIs that were regularly used, that were making themselves available.
Did you prioritise investigations to particular investigators dependent upon the likely skill set that would be needed for individual investigations?
Not just myself, but those that were doing the FI deployments and allocations. That was the avenue that we did go down to ensure that our more experienced fire investigators were put onto those bigger jobs.
Most experienced fire investigators put onto the bigger jobs.
That's correct, yes.
Is that right? Thank you. We might just have that page removed from the screen so that we can have Mr. Fulliger back. There we go. I want to ask some questions now, Mr. Fulliger, about current arrangements for authorised fire investigators being authorised. Presently, what are the prerequisites for even entering into training to become an authorised fire investigator?
Yeah, RFS staff and volunteers must have our crew leader qualification and minimum of 5 years experience in fighting wildfires and wildfire behaviour, and the prerequisite of protect and preserve an incident scene.
Sorry, what was the last one? Protect and preserve.
Protect and preserve an incident scene.
Is that some sort of training that the RFS provides to crew members more generally?
Yes, it is.
Assuming that one meets the prerequisites to enter training, how would one apply?
Through an EOI process that they submit through their district office to their area command for approval, and then into the Fire Investigation and Compliance Unit.
The RFS have provided a copy of a form that people seem to be able to fill in to register their interest in training. Is that a form used as part of that process?
Yeah, that's the EOI process, yes.
Then what does the entry-level training involve for AFIs?
The entry level is once they're approved onto the course, it is a blended learning type course where they do the theory online at their own pace or discretion, but they do need to keep to a timetable and undertake online theory assessments.
How many hours does that typically involve?
It's spread over approximately 3 months to undertake that part of the training.
But is that 2 hours in total or 10 hours in total, or?
That's up to the individual as to how much they put into that time.
Is it something like reading modules and then doing an assessment task?
So yes, so they have reading modules and other reading materials to go through and then undertake the assessments.
How many assessments do they complete in that approximate 3-month period?
2.
And is that before they come to the first round of physical training or training in person?
They can undertake fireground training from the moment they start, but we do bring them in for 3 days face-to-face, which does include refresher and examining fire scenes.
So let's turn then to that fireground training, the 3 days face-to-face. Where is it conducted?
Currently, the first one has been conducted at Dubbo. We've got second one was conducted in the Central Coast, and the third one will be conducted down in the southeast in around Cooma.
Are they specially prepared facilities where your trainee AFIs can come onto a fireground and literally be trained in how to read things like macro and micro indicators?
It's areas that we need to physically burn ourselves. It could be private property, it could be council land or park or forest. We do have to get the normal approvals from the landowners to undertake that training. But yes, it is for them to hone their skills on the indicators.
And is that largely what is involved in those 3 days of face-to-face training?
That's correct, yes.
Is there further face-to-face training offered before someone can be authorised as a fire investigator?
Yeah, following the face-to-face sessions, they'll then undertake a practical assessment, which will include 2 scene examinations.
Yes.
Writing of a FI report, a statement, and then they go through a court setting process.
Is that all within that first 3 days of face-to-face?
No, that's a separate session again.
All right. Well, I won't run them together too much. They finish their 3 days face-to-face training and assume that they do well in the practical assessments there. What's next?
Once they've completed the 4 components of the practical assessment and they're deemed competent, we then put a submission to the Deputy Commissioner of Field Operations for their approval as an authorised fire investigator.
But can that authorisation happen after they've finished the online component and done the 2 assessments there and then finished the 3 days face-to-face practical assessment?
So it's once they've completed all the components. So it can only be done after they've completed their practical assessments and their theory assessments.
But that's what I'm getting at. We're talking about the theory assessments. The theory component happens online, might take up to 3 months, involves 2 assessments.
Yep,
and
2 theory assessments.
And then at the 3-day face-to-face practical component.
That's correct.
Is that it, or is there more?
No. Then there's a practical assessment that they undertake, which includes two fire scenes that they need to examine.
Yes. Is the
undertake?
I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off because we're not in the same room. You go on. You finish your answer, please.
So once they've completed their scene examinations, they have to complete a fire investigation report that they have to submit. They have to complete a statement that they have to submit, and that will then put through a court setting, as in giving evidence in court. And after that process, if they're deemed competent, we can then seek authorisation for them.
What I'm trying to get at is whether the 3-day face-to-face practical component includes all of those elements, including the writing of the report and the courtroom practice, so that someone might actually go up to the Deputy Commissioner for authorisation at the conclusion of the 3-day training component.
No, it doesn't.
So they're separate. The 3 days is just focused on training?
It's just focused on training, refresher, and training on the fireground, yes.
And then once someone finishes the 3 days of training, are they required to undertake more online theory components before being assessed, including via the courtroom scenario?
There's no more online training once they've completed the face-to-face. We encourage that they get onto some burnt ground to continue with their field training, but obviously weather does impact into that as well.
Depends on what's happening in their rural fire service district.
That's correct, yes.
So at some point after the completion of the 3 days face-to-face training, they can attend for an assessment to determine whether or not their name will ultimately be put up as an authorised fire investigator.
That's correct, yes.
Assume that their name is put up to become an authorised fire investigator. Are they thereafter required to undertake some sort of probationary period which allows them to work as an AFI but under supervision or with another AFI at the scene?
Well, we wouldn't say it was under a probationary period, but we certainly encourage that once they have been authorised and to gain more experience, they do team up with a more experienced fire investigator, but that doesn't always happen.
Is there then a minimum level of refresher training that they're required to complete each year or so in order to maintain authorisation?
Yes, they are. They're required to undertake at least one fire investigation per year. If that's not possible, get onto some burnt ground and again hone their skills on their indicators and document what they have done on that scene.
Does someone within the organisation monitor that?
Currently, well, we have actually started doing that since about 2018, and we're still in the process of fine-tuning how that process will go through. Will continue.
Are the skills of an authorised fire investigator, like many skills, they become honed through experience and repetition?
Correct, yes.
And is it possible that in a district that has not had need for fire investigations to take place in recent years, is it possible that an authorised fire investigator might continue to be authorised even though they haven't completed one fire investigation per year, but they've been otherwise able to demonstrate they've been getting onto burnt ground to try and continue to develop their skills?
Yes, their authorisation would continue.
How do you try and maintain quality control over the reports that the AFIs are ultimately producing?
Each report that comes in is technically and administratively reviewed by, at this point, the Fire Investigation and Compliance Unit to ensure that the reports meet our requirements, the service requirements.
What sort of things might that administrative review pick up that you would go back to an AFI and say, all right, let's
Summary of findings, some wording that can be construed and read in a number of ways. We try to ensure that if their hypothesis is, for example, suspicious, that they are wording within their summary of findings the reasons why they have gone to that.
Does it
conclusion.
extend? I'm sorry. Finish your answer.
No, that's.
Does it extend to looking at the photographs that are frequently attached to the AFI report and confirming that what has been, for instance, documented as protection or cupping or angle of char in certain photos is actually recorded in the photos?
That's correct, yes.
Is there any opportunity for authorised fire investigators to return to the sites where the face-to-face training is conducted and actually, again, walk a fire ground with someone from your unit and confirm that their current competencies are up to scratch?
Well, that could be facilitated, yes.
And does it ever happen?
At this point in time, no, it hasn't.
I want to, I should give you an opportunity to respond. Do you have anything that you want to add on that topic of the training of authorised fire investigators?
The only thing I would add is that the course has undergone a comprehensive review in the last 18 months.
So since this season?
Since this season, and that's in line with the national competency and training standards. And I'd also point out that the fire investigators themselves, the authorised fire investigators, are also able to attend professional development opportunities such as the State Fire Investigation Forum that was held at Dubbo earlier this year, where there's a number of sessions in terms of skills maintenance, awareness and other sessions as well. So it's not just largely on training, but there's also the opportunity for professional development as well. So
different to the original 3-day face-to-face training, but other opportunities offered?
Yeah, so this is about the fire investigators coming to Dubbo, for example, at the training academy, where they're able to network, share their skills and experiences, attend, professional development sessions, specific, sessions with police or other kindred agencies.
In terms of the changes to the training since the 2019-2020 season, is that to bring training conducted in New South Wales into line with training conducted in other states and territories? Is there now a national focus to core competencies and the like?
So there already was a national competency around that. That has been amended, so that is consistent across the jurisdictions. But it was also to incorporate the different learning styles that Mark talked about, that blended learning. So theory with the practical elements, etc., online. So it was to look at how we make that more accessible to volunteers in particular.
Mr Fulliger, have there been other changes to the way in which authorised fire investigators are trained since the 2019-2020 season that you wanted to discuss with the court?
Well, only within the training site, no, there's not. But going on what Mr Millington said, we've actually run 3 FI forums this year. We just completed one in Wagga on the weekend for FIs. So again, that professional development for them.
So that's a forum conducted by the RFS to bring investigators into a centre and have further training or further opportunities for discussions with other fire investigators. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And how often are they held?
We try to hold them yearly and in 4 locations. We obviously during the COVID period we couldn't do that. We were doing some online education and nights with our volunteers and staff, fire investigators. Prior to 2018, well, since I started in the unit in 2010, we were doing forums each year across the state.
Can it be difficult to get volunteers to leave their districts, perhaps their farms, their properties, their employment, to travel to centres for these sort of training opportunities?
Look, potentially, yes, and I think that's why, rather than just having one central forum, for example, at Dubbo or Sydney, Mr. Fulliger and the team have opted to conduct those in regional locations to try and, lessen that travel or accessibility.
Anything further, Mr. Fulliger?
I'm just going to say that certainly our FIs are more than happy to come along to those forums and attend. So yes, there is, for some of them there is some travel, but they're keen and they want to enhance their skills, etc.
I want to ask you both some questions now about something that is referred to in the current Memorandum of Understanding that involves the RFS, Fire and Rescue New South Wales and New South Wales Police. Mr. Millington, I might focus these questions at you because are you familiar with the scope of the current MOU?
I am.
One of the things that the MOU talks about is establishing major incident bushfire rapid response investigations via something called an investigation liaison team to be established at New South Wales RFS headquarters. Mm-hmm. Would you like me to take you to the part of the memorandum that sets out those sets out the nature of that team and that investigation? So if we can have brought up on screen, please, the memorandum itself. If we're still in tab 32, you might find it behind page 2625. It's in the brief in a number of places, Your Honour, but I think the closest one is page 2625. This is a particular page of the memorandum that's going to come up. All right, it might be hard for you to read in that format, Mr. Millington. 4.4, partway down the page, refers to major incident bushfire rapid response investigations. Do you see that? Okay. And could you just read the paragraph that sits below? Just read it to yourself and tell me when you've finished.
Thank you.
What's the intention behind the use of the investigation liaison teams that's referred to in that paragraph?
It largely is intended to achieve a level of coordination and negate any duplication. So where police may be attending a scene, for example, as well as a Rural Fire Service authorised fire investigator, I guess it's to ensure a greater level of coordination and to negate duplication where possible.
Was an an investigation liaison team of this sort stood up at any time over the 2019-2020 season, to your knowledge?
Not in a formal sense, no. I guess given the sheer number of fires and the duration of that season, there was arrangements in place whereby the RFS was liaising regularly with Strikeforce Toronto personnel. So that work was already being done in that sense. So it would, it wasn't necessarily activated through this ILT arrangement or investigation liaison team arrangement. It was achieved through other means.
Are investigation liaison team arrangements triggered very frequently through a so-called normal fire season?
Not regularly, no.
Have you ever had any involvement with an ILT, or are you aware of an ILT ever being used?
An ILT was, I'd suggest, loosely established for the Tathra fires.
And again, loosely established, does that mean it might not have had that formal name?
It wasn't formally declared as such, but certainly Police, Fire and Rescue New South Wales and the Rural Fire Service came together to ensure a coordinated approach to that investigation. Detective
Chief Inspector Puffett yesterday was similarly asked about whether an ILT was used at Tathra, and he said it was not. But are you there you're saying it wasn't formally called an ILT even at Tathro. It was doing the work of an ILT, but it wasn't formally stood up.
Correct.
Are ILTs ever formally used?
It's very infrequent.
Can you remember a fire in which it's been formally used?
Not that I could recall.
Tell me if you agree. We start using the ILT as contemplated in the Memorandum of Understanding on those events that its use is indicated, or if they're not being used, there's no need for them in the MOU.
The MOU is due for review next year, and that's certainly an area that could potentially be further, scoped.
The whole point, though, of the MOU is for there to be adequate communication between the three agencies to make sure that the work that would ideally be done under an investigation liaison team is actually performed, regardless of what the structure that sits around it is called.
Yeah, look, as I said before, I think that there are processes in place that enable that communication and coordination through other means, not necessarily through the ILT. And I take your point that certainly could be reconsidered as part of the MO review next year.
Without dismissing the idea of the importance of joint investigations, it's just about finding a structure that everyone is clear about and that can be stood up when needed.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Your Honour, is that a convenient time? I'm now going to move on to some specific questions for the Mount McKenzie and then the Gross Valley file.
Yes, we'll take the morning adjournment and resume at 12.
Please all stand. Oh, it's got a hazard regime.
Yes, Ms Ward.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'm going to ask some specific questions now based upon the investigation into the fire known as the Mount McKenzie Tenterfield fire. Mr Fulger, what was your role in the investigation into that fire?
I attended on one day with Mr. May at McKenzie Road, at Mount McKenzie.
Why was that?
I was in the area at the time, and he asked if I could come down and attend with him.
As a general practice, does the RFS encourage the presence of two authorised fire investigators at a scene investigation if possible?
If possible, yes.
Why is that?
Gives the fire investigator the opportunity to have a second set of eyes and to bounce ideas and hypotheses off.
In terms of the investigation into this fire, the AFI formed the opinion that the most probable cause of the fire was accidental transmission as a result of power line arcing. The court has since received expert evidence, including further evidence from the authorised fire investigator, suggesting that the cause is best recorded as undetermined. So I'm just asking you to bear that in mind, Mr Fulliger, as I ask the further questions. Would you agree, Mr Fulliger, that it's important that the authorised fire investigators include within their report relevant evidence that may support or detract from their hypotheses as to fire causation?
Yes.
It's important, isn't it, for the report to reveal the chain of reasoning that the AFI has employed so that the rigour of their conclusion can be understood by someone reading the report?
Yes.
Here, there was a report which, as I have said, initially identified the probable cause of fire as accidental transmission as a result of power line arcing. And it transpires that a conversation with energy workers that were at the scene of the fire on the day of the AFI, one of the days that the AFI conducted his investigation, the energy workers provided information suggesting that no network fault had triggered, or in other words, the recloser had not been tripped. Ideally, that intelligence from an energy worker at the scene should be included within the AFI's report as being one factor that might support or detract from the hypotheses as to fire causation. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it should. Yes, it should.
As we've already heard this morning, the Service Standard 3.1.9 has changed since 2019-2020. And one of the things that seems to be emphasised in the new standard is a requirement for the AFI to maintain record keeping and include canvassing reports of persons that have provided relevant information at the scene. Mr Fulliger, is that a change in the current version of the service standard, or was something similar expected back in 2019-2020?
I think it's an inclusion in the 2021 one, in the 2021 policy service standard, I should say, but it was certainly a requirement prior to the 2019-2025 season.
It's made more explicit in the current draft.
That's correct, yes.
It's not to suggest, is it, that the AFI has any particular role in canvassing witnesses themselves at the scene, although that might happen in limited circumstances if, for instance, investigating police are not there, but someone at the scene is volunteering information to the AFI.
Yeah, the authorised fire investigators should canvass any witnesses, first responders to that fire to ascertain what they saw, what they observed, what they may have heard, etc.
And there's now a canvassing form for that purpose that's included within RFS material for the AFI to use to record details obtained from witnesses at the scene.
Yes, we created that template for the AFIs. Previously, it would have been included as part of their contemporaneous notes.
Just in a notebook or somewhere like that?
In a notebook, yes.
Similarly, we're aware that the AFI at the scene used a magnet to collect metal fragments from different points of interest at the scene, which were then provided to New South Wales Police. Would you agree that if these fragments were thought to be significant enough that New South Wales Police should be asked to secure them as an exhibit, the report should ideally explain the potential relevance of the fragments?
It should.
The court is aware of a number of witnesses to this fire in its early stages who were involved in attempting to suppress the fire. So, Your Honour, for Your Honour's purpose and for the purpose of those at the bar table, I'm putting to one side for the moment a witness who was in the cemetery who says that she saw a flash at a later point. I'm just focusing on witnesses at the scene who saw the fire in its early stages and who made attempts to extinguish it. Mr Fullagat, none of these witnesses reported seeing any flash of light or hearing any noise that might be associated with arcing. If that evidence had been communicated to the AFI, that type of witness statement would be of potential relevance to the cause of fire being recorded as power line arcing. Do you agree with that?
It could go towards that, yes.
And that's the type of information that should ideally be shared between New South Wales Police and the AFI who's conducting the investigation.
Most definitely.
The officers in charge of these investigations might be themselves relatively inexperienced in fire investigation, and they might not themselves understand the significance of evidence that they're taking from early witnesses at the scene. Does that put the obligation back on the expert AFI to be asking the OIC about what information the OIC might have already obtained in the course of their investigation?
That can be part of the AFI's inquiries with police, yes. But police are not obliged to actually give us all that information depending on whether there's criminality involved.
Yes, but I'm just focusing on this situation where you might have an OIC at the scene who is themselves inexperienced in fire investigations, and they might have a piece of information that your AFI thinks would ultimately find very useful, but the OIC might not know enough to volunteer the information to the AFI in the first place. Do you follow the scenario I'm putting?
Yes.
So how do you inculcate with your AFIs, your fire investigators, the need for them to be proactive and themselves ask the OIC, what sort of information have you obtained? What have you heard from early witnesses or first responders?
That would come from experience working with police from the AFI. Nor if they have any concerns about that, they would normally make contact with the unit, and we would give them some advice and or on how to obtain that information if they believe they needed it.
Would it not also be useful within training for your authorised fire investigators to encourage them to be in contact with the OIC and ask the OIC about what sort of information might have been collected by the police to date?
That certainly can be included further within our training package, yes.
It's a matter for police what they would volunteer in reply.
That's correct, yes.
But if the person at the scene who best understands fire causation is the Rural Fire Service AFI, it's important, isn't it, to encourage them to be exploring with police, well, what sort of evidence might you have that could help me do my job?
It is, yes.
Slightly different situation if there's also a FETS officer from police there at the same time as the RFS, isn't it?
Well, the FETS officer and the AFI would be working together, and I think police would probably be more happy to pass that information across to the FETS officer, yes.
Similarly, within the Mount McKenzie brief of evidence, the court is aware of a number of witnesses to the fire in early stages who had been at the scene in an older style car, which they had pulled over somewhere on the verge at the side of the road. Their presence at the scene is something that should ideally be shared with the AFI, because one of the things the AFI needs to do is consider the possibility of exhaust or mechanical cause for the fire.
That's correct, yes.
If at the scene of any fire, the AFI believes there would be benefit in soil samples being taken, that's something that the AFI should be discussing with the OIC or the FETS investigator if there's a FETS investigator present at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. That's correct, yes.
Okay, I want to now move on to some questions arising from the investigation into the Gross Valley fire. Before I do so, Mr. Millington, do you have anything that you want to say in response to those specifics arising from the Mount McKenzie fire?
No, thank you.
In terms of the Gross Valley fire, just so that we're clear, I'm talking about the fire that's believed to have commenced as a result of a spot over from an RFS backburn which jumped Mount Wilson Road and started burning to the east of that road. Do you both understand what the fire I'm referring to?
Yes.
So far as the court is aware, there has never been a fire scene investigation conducted at the point of interest nominated by the officer in charge of the investigation. Mr. Millington, I think you were in court this morning, were you, when she gave some evidence around that?
Yes, I was.
Are either of you aware of whether any such examination was conducted by your organisation at any time?
Not at that point of interest nominated, no.
Mr. Fulliger?
No, not that I'm aware of.
And again, I'm focusing on a scene investigation at the point she nominated. Mr. Millington, are you aware of any investigation of that scene since that time?
No.
So far as the evidence before the court sets out a chronology, it appears that there had been early liaison between police and RFS in order to send a team to the scene nominated by the OIC for a cause and origin investigation, but ultimately that did not happen. It took place at another scene. Do either of you know why it was or how it came to be that the scene she had nominated was not actually subject to a scene investigation?
No, I don't.
Mr. Fulliger?
Oh, no, I don't.
At the very least, shouldn't the officer in charge of the investigation have been notified of an intention to vary the planned investigation scene that she had originally nominated? Mr. Millington?
Yes, I agree.
And Mr. Fulliger, would you agree?
Only to the point where the AFI was tasked, our AFI was tasked with the investigation, origin and cause of the Green Valley fire. The location where police wanted to investigate would have been a separate request and investigation for that.
Now, you've said Green Valley. I think you mean Gross Valley.
Oh, sorry, Gross Valley. Yes, sorry.
And regardless of how the naming of the fire might have, I withdraw that. Mr. Fulliger, the officer in charge of this investigation requested an investigation at a particular scene. That scene investigation did not go ahead. At the very least, shouldn't the person who determined not to proceed to that point that she had nominated have ensured that she was given notice of that change?
Most definitely.
Notice of that sort would have been consistent with the Memorandum of Understanding and the focus on shared decision-making between the fire investigation agencies. Do you agree with that, Mr. Millington? And Mr. Fulliger?
Yeah, correct.
Now, of course, we don't know whether it was RFS or New South Wales Police or a combination of the two that were involved in a discussion that ultimately meant the scene investigation did not take place where the OIC had asked for it to take place. But regardless of who was responsible for that change in plan, is your answer the same, that she should have been advised of the intended change in plan?
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a number of conversations that were occurring both within the RFS and police that obviously led to that advice not being forwarded to the officer in charge.
There are, along with this fire, there have been other investigations that Her Honour has considered across this season where the RFS have conducted a cause and origin investigation extending to attempts to determine where a fire has crossed either an LGA boundary or has moved from one Section 44 declaration field into another field. Does that make sense the way I've described it? Yes. Mr. Fulliger, can you follow what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Why is the RFS interested in conducting scene examinations at the point where a fire is believed to have crossed such boundaries? Mr. Millington first.
From an incident management perspective, the declarations, a declaration is made so that the fire can be coordinated loosely based on rural fire districts or local government area boundaries. So that purpose allows us to undertake that investigation for those reasons.
If the RFS already has intel suggesting that the fire has moved from one boundary into another boundary, why do you need a cause and origin investigation to assist an incident management team coordinate the response to the fire?
Look, it's also to determine the cause and origin. There may be other reasons why that fire either crossed or ignited in an adjoining boundary. So it gives us certainty around the cause. Whilst there's an assumption that it could be made that the fire has crossed, I guess in some instances there's a need for that certainty to be undertaken.
One thing that fire investigators need to be alive to is the possibility of arson being perpetrated under the cover of wildfire.
Correct.
Mr. Fullagar, do you want to add anything to this topic?
Not at the moment.
So, if it's important to conduct a cause and origin investigation at the scene where fire may have spread across a boundary line, that philosophy must be of equal application to new fires commencing within a boundary area. Would you agree?
In principle, yes.
So, with the Growth Valley fire, there is a new fire to the east of Mount Wilson Road, and it would be just as important, would it not, to attempt a scene investigation at the point where that ignition occurred, as it would be to attempt a scene investigation at the point where that fire crossed a boundary.
Yes, so the service standard outlines any fires within that area of the Section 44 declaration, so that would be consistent, yes.
Mr. Fullagar, did you want to respond to that?
No, that's correct.
Even if there had been an investigation of the scene to the east of Mount Wilson Road, it's unlikely that that investigation would have provided intelligence that would permit anyone to draw a conclusion as to which sector of the backburn had led to the spot over at the scene. Is that a fair statement?
I'll defer to Mr. Fullagar on that as a trained
Thank you.
investigator.
Can you just repeat that for me, please?
Even if an AFI had been able to access the scene east of Mount Wilson Road and conduct an investigation determining where that spot over originated, it's unlikely that the investigation would have provided any intelligence to help one understand whether the spot over originated from one sector or another of the backburn that was set along Bell's Line of Road and the western edge of Mount Wilson Road. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct, yes.
But that's not a reason to not conduct a cause and origin investigation there, because amongst other things, you want to try and exclude the possibility of arson under cover of wildfire. Is that fair to say,
Correct.
Mr. Millington?
Yeah.
Go. And Mr. Fullagar?
Yes.
Excuse me, can I just ask a question before we move on, Ms. Ward, on something that, on an answer that has been given by Mr. Millington. Both of you agreed that it would have been consistent with the MOU for the information to have been given to the OIC that a different area was going to be looked at. And I think, Mr. Millington, you said something to the effect that there were a number of conversations within the RFS and police, which I don't know if you said exactly this, but I took it to mean that, which may have resulted in the OIC not being informed. What do you mean by that, or what kind of conversations? And that to me sounds like it might be a problem with communication if that is what happened.
Look, the MOU outlines the arrangements between police and the RFS, and certainly we have a liaison officer embedded within Strike Force Toronto that acts as a conduit for information and advice. There were times during that season where requests for information or the like were occurring outside of those agreed structures. So, for example, the OIC was approaching RFS staff members direct, while other conversations were occurring between the agreed process of Strike Force Toronto and our embedded liaison officer, if that makes sense, Your Honour.
Thank you. Ms. Ward, I'm not sure if you wanted to seek any further clarification around that.
Was there some sort of policy in place for that season or agreement or procedure that restricted an officer in charge of an investigation from contacting the RFS fire investigation team directly and only going through Strike Force Toronto?
No, there was no direction that prevented that, no. But for coordination purposes, and again, to avoid duplication and access that information as quickly as possible, that was an arrangement or agreement made between the two organisations.
To, on the one hand, streamline procedures from the point of view of the organisation, but from the point of view of the particular officer in charge, it might actually add an extra layer because they have to go from themselves to someone else in police to the RFS.
But potentially, you also had FETS involved as well, you know, which again was another stakeholder involved in that process as well.
Yes. So again, I come back to this point. Tell me if you agree. Regardless of how it came about, regardless of whether it was police or RFS or jointly, that a decision was made not to go to the scene that the OIC had nominated, she should have been told about that change in plan.
If the officer in charge requested that, yes, she should have been informed why that hadn't occurred.
If she requested what, sorry?
The investigation at that point of origin, she should have been at least advised that was not occurring or that had been varied for whatever reason, yes.
I want to now just ask you some questions raised firstly by the Department of Planning and Environment on behalf of the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service. And if you'll just bear with me, I'll bring it up on this screen. All right. This is just something that's been sent to the court on behalf of National Parks and Wildlife. And they say to the court, National Parks and Wildlife Service is raising this issue because it is of the view that there are opportunities for better coordination between agencies, such as National Parks and Wildlife Service, RFS and New South Wales Police, at the investigation stage. Because agencies like National Parks and Wildlife Service have specialised knowledge about land tenure, topography and local fire activity, it would be useful to ensure that fire investigators are appropriately briefed by agency officers about the history and or behaviour of a fire, for example. This will help ensure that key people are interviewed and the broader context of a fire is taken into account to ensure that the most accurate conclusions are reached and important lessons are learned. Does that sound like a sensible step to take in cases where the fire that is being investigated has likely originated within National Parks and Wildlife territory, Mr. Fullagar?
Yes.
And in fact, it happens routinely in many fire investigations, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Sometimes the National Parks and Wildlife Service provide the first responding crews to a fire.
That's correct, yes.
Sometimes they are the first witnesses to a fire.
Correct.
And sometimes they're involved in incident management for fires within national park boundaries.
That's correct, yes.
What this suggestion seems to point to, though, is the desirability of making sure that authorised fire investigators are contacting National Parks and Wildlife Service to check if there is any additional information that might be relevant to cause and origin. Is there a way that, does that seem like a sensible initiative?
Yes, it is a sensible initiative, yes.
Is it something that's worth exploring with National Parks and Wildlife Service in terms of something that you would prompt your authorised fire investigators to do?
Yes.
I mean, there might be many fires where contact is made and nothing further of any relevance is learnt, but the contact needs to be made in the first place.
Yes, correct.
Do you have anything to add on that score, Mr. Millington?
The only thing I would add is potentially, rather than singling out National Parks and Wildlife Service, other agencies that have land tenure, you know, that, such as Crown Lands or State Forests, for example. So it may be something that is applied more broadly to land tenure managers rather than just national parks itself.
What if the fire starts on privately owned land? How do your AFIs decide what they may or may not want to ask the owner of the land, the person who manages the farm or the bush block or whatever, in terms of their experience of local fire history?
The AFI would canvass the person as to what they witnessed, and that should be included then as part of their report.
And again, Mr. Fullager, are you suggesting that the AFI would conduct that interview themselves, or might it be something that they could discuss with New South Wales Police and obtain statements if they're already available to police?
Well, that is an option that is available to the authorised fire investigator.
It's just often the authorised fire investigator is at the scene before New South Wales Police are at a point where they can start taking statements. Would that be fair to say?
That's correct, yes.
Now, there'd be some scenes that your authorised fire investigators attend where the cause and origin is clear and there's no need to canvass further witness statements. Is that right?
It's certainly encouraged to take it to canvass as many people as they can to get their views of what had happened.
Are you envisaging that the AFIs would literally door knock homes along a country street, or is it really about engaging with people that they might see as they travel out to the site?
It could be both. It could be depending on where the fire is and what has happened. It may be door knocking neighbouring properties just to ascertain whether they witnessed anything or saw anything.
It seems to be a consistent part of the procedure that your team involve, that they begin by attending the Incident Management Centre and take information provided from the Incident Management team so that they are briefed in that respect before they travel to the scene. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, yes.
And in many of the fires that Her Honour has investigated, they've travelled to the scene with one of the local brigades or one of the first responders to the fire who've introduced them to the scene, for want of a better term. Is that a regular part of the process that's often involved?
Yes, it is. If the crews have already left the scene, that would be a process that would be undertaken.
Particularly across this summer, where so many of the scene investigations were taking place weeks after the fire had first ignited. Would you agree?
Especially so. Especially so, yes.
I'm now going to put some matters to you raised by New South Wales Police in relation to the Good fire. And because this neatly raises the topic of fire naming conventions, I'm going to have Mr. Millington ask that Mr. Millington be shown this statement. Thank you, Sean. Do you recognise that document?
I do.
Is it a statement that was prepared in your name, responding to the issues of naming of fires and amalgamation of fires?
Yes, it is.
Have you had an opportunity to review the statement recently?
I have.
And is it true and correct?
It is.
So could Her Honour receive that statement on the basis that you adopt it as your evidence on the matters set out therein?
That is correct.
I don't mean to be impolite. The statement, though, was taken 1 or 2 years ago or drafted?
That is correct.
All right. So we should add a year to the age that's referred to in paragraph 2.
Make that 2.
No, okay. All right. I don't think anything turns on it, but nonetheless. I'll tender that document, Your Honour.
There's no objection. That will be
No, Your Honour.
Exhibit 63.
So the section I particularly wanted to take you to, sorry. Have you still got a copy?
I have it in front of me, yes.
The section I want to particularly take you to is paragraph 9, where you talk about the naming of fires by the RFS.
Yes.
Just to put this in context, some of the Strike Force Toronto police who've given evidence have expressed a level of frustration about naming conventions and about their investigations into fires which proved to be the continuation of a pre-existing fire that had been given a new name as it crossed a particular boundary, either LGA or Section 44 boundary.
Yes.
So that's the broad context. I then want to ask some questions so that the court can understand why it is that the RFS adopts particular models for naming fires.
Yes.
Paragraph 9, you say when a fire is reported to the New South Wales RFS, an incident is created in the system that's known as ICON, and you say this system is used by all fire agencies. So does that mean that Fire and Rescue New South Wales is also able to access ICON?
Yes.
And police can access ICON in certain circumstances, is that right?
That's correct.
How do they arrange access?
It's an internet-based system and routinely agencies, not just police, but agencies request an account. That account's created and login details or user details are provided to that respective individual.
So that those respective individuals can access the ICON system from their own desktop using the login details.
Correct.
Paragraph 11, you say that when creating an incident in ICON, the name of the incident is auto-generated from the details received through OOO.
Correct.
Is it auto-generated by reference to where the fire is reported to OOO as burning?
That's correct.
So will it pick up on a place name or something in that report?
Yes, in principle, yes.
What about in actuality?
It's an address, yes. So what's reported at the time by the caller.
What if the caller is driving through country New South Wales, not a local, reports it as location X, but that location is actually wrong?
So the system, when it's entered into, the 000 call is taken, it's entered into a system. The system requires a location to be nominated, so pinpointed into a map, so that would then gazetteer, the response or the location details. So it can sometimes be incorrect based on the advice provided by the caller at the time.
Can someone, though, later override manually to say this is a fire that in fact is burning in location Y, so we'll change the name?
And that happens regularly.
You go on to say there that where it doesn't occur through the auto-generation process, the operator will enter basic details, including incident location, And that might then be used in the same way to trigger the name of the fire on icon. Is that right?
That's correct.
At the end of paragraph 11, you say general practice is to name the fire based on a geographical area that is of relevance to the broader community.
That's correct.
Why is that important?
Because we use that name for our warnings and information, and to generate community awareness that there's a fire burning in their locality. So by using local names and references, that promotes a lot more awareness and understanding of the location itself.
Coming then to a proposal raised by New South Wales Police in the Good fire. This applies in the scenario where a large fire extends beyond either an LGA boundary or a Section 44 declared area. And the suggestion from police is, why not keep the name of the original fire but add a numeral to the end? So what started as Mount McKenzie fire might become Mount McKenzie 2 when it crosses a boundary, or Mount McKenzie 3 when it crosses another boundary. Can I ask you to respond to that possibility as a naming convention?
Look, I still think that runs the risk of confusion. I think that also takes away from that local understanding or reference point, particularly where we see large-scale fires burning 100 kilometres apart. You know, what's relevant to community over here is very different to an understanding of community B over here. So I don't necessarily agree with that proposal. I think research that we've undertaken post-fires show that the naming, you know, community understanding of those local references is probably optimal.
In other words, if I live 100 kilometres away from Mount McKenzie, I might not be alerted that a fire called Mount McKenzie 2 is actually about to impact upon my community.
That's correct. And what is Mount McKenzie 2? Yeah, that's correct.
So again, the primacy is given to naming fires by reference to geographical locations that locals can understand when it's used within warnings and alerts.
Correct.
Perhaps what matters is not so much how fires are named when they cross boundaries, but ensuring that police and RFS understand the conventions that are being used.
Yes, I agree.
There's a suggestion from Detective Senior Constable Waldron in Good Fire that when a fire is merged, so when two fires start to burn together, the information for the merged fires is not carried across on icon to the main fire. So that you might find on icon information for the main fire, but you'll lose the early information from the other fire before it merged. Does that make sense?
Yes,
You understand what I'm talking about?
I do understand it.
All right. Now, what's your understanding as to what should happen when fires merge in terms of information travelling across on icon?
So if one fire merges with another fire, the original fire is referenced into the newly merged created fire, for want of a better word, and the record shows the icon or the fire reference numbers that has now been merged. So there is a reference in icon to say fire A is merged with fire B, and allows the operator to obtain the documents within that merged fire.
When you say operator, do you mean someone sitting at the desktop access?
Yes, correct. Yes, a user.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that you should be able to go onto icon for one fire,
yes,
and be able to see that another flyer has merged with this.
Yes.
And if I want to access material generated in the earlier fire, I just need to go to another part of icon.
Correct.
Does icon become unwieldy when you're having to manage so many fires at once, as across the 2019-2020 season, and some of those fires are so big that they're burning for months?
Correct, yes.
Is someone experienced in operating icon quickly able to sort their way through the various fields and get to the most relevant information for their purposes?
like any system, I think the more you use it and the more access you have available to the system, the more more you're able to get the information out. But look, I think there's certainly some room for enhancements in the system, but it was able to capture and held up well during that 1920 season where it collated and recorded a substantial amount of records.
Mr. Fulliger, just from your perspective, conducting actual authorised fire investigations, are you able to, where fires have merged and you're being asked to investigate each of the fires in a particular grouping, are you able to use ICON in the way that Mr. Millington has flagged? Are you able to see from ICON that there is a related, this fire includes some related fires that have since joined, and I can go and look in another part of ICON for early information about those earlier fires?
Yeah, most definitely.
One of the things then that might be beneficial in light of what Detective Senior Constable Waldron has said, echoed by other arson squad detectives in matters Her Honour has inquired into, would be some level of training for police in knowing where to look in ICON for a sign that there is another ICON file, for want of a better term, that they should be checking. Does that sound sensible?
The RFS regularly conducts ICON training and awareness sessions for police and other agencies, and I agree, if there was an opportunity to provide more comprehensive training to the arson team or others within police, we would certainly welcome that.
Police have told the court that they found some of the material that they could obtain from ICON particularly useful in their investigations across this season. And in particular, sorry, I've just lost it in my notes. The fire progression reports. They have told the court that those reports assist greatly in the course of their investigation and are very important documents, but say that due to the size taken to produce those maps, there can be a great delay in them getting them. So firstly, Mr. Millington, can you summarise how those fire progression maps are actually produced?
So the fire progression maps are prepared by the fire behaviour team or the predictive services team. They're drafted using the fire predictions themselves and are then analysed and cross-referenced with other data sources such as satellite imagery and our line scanning imagery, so that the imagery that's taken by aircraft flying above at any point in time. So there's a lot of analysis work that's undertaken to incorporate that into a single document.
Because they're pulling together separate sources, and presumably if those sources give a contradictory reading, they have to examine further to try and work out the true reach of the fire.
That's correct.
The suggestion from New South Wales Police is that the RFS may want to look at incorporating the production of these type of reports during the Section 44 period when resources are at their greatest in terms of people working as part of the incident management team. Did you want to respond to that possibility?
It's certainly a possibility. I think the reports have shown their worth and have been welcomed by numerous agencies as being an excellent information to show the progression of the fire. That's certainly something we could consider, but again, would note that there is a lot of time in an analysis in preparing those reports.
Could it assist in that regard if police were able to identify the information that they are particularly interested in? For example, there might be an investigation where they really want the fire progression mapping for the first 2 days, for argument's sake, the first 2 days of fire spread, because that goes into the cause and origin investigation. And then they might want the final fire progression mapping, which shows the entire footprint of the fire, which helps them canvass locals and get estimates of building damage and destruction of property and the like. Do you follow the two different uses they might put those maps to?
Yes.
If they were to come to your organisation and say, we don't need the 3 months worth of fire progression maps that sit in between those two, we just want the first 2 days and the last 2 days, is that an easier process for your organisation to respond to?
Look, I'm not, involved in the drafting of the reports, but I think that would more than likely reduce the workload and speed up a return time.
Police have emphasised the value of the footage that they've received in their investigations from the various Firebird aircraft patrolling the scene and providing live feed back to the incident management teams. Have there been any change in aerial resources available to RFS since this season that allows even further footage to be obtained from your Firebird resources?
Most definitely. So in addition to contract aircraft that allow video footage to be streamed to incident management team and are recorded, so for reference purposes down the track, the RFS has been able to procure additional helicopters with this live streaming capability. They're currently based in Sydney and Dubbo with the view of also locating them in Coffs Harbour and Tumut by the end of the year. But in addition to that, we've also been able to source fixed-wing aircraft, 2 fixed-wing aircraft with the line scanning capability. So that's certainly enhanced, the availability of aircraft and that technology to the RFS since that season.
Are there technological advances coming that will also assist with cause and origin investigations?
Potentially, there's a lot of work being done with tertiary institutions, universities, the Minderoo Foundation around satellite detection and satellite monitoring, for example. So there has been a lot of work that has commenced since the 1920 season that is being progressed.
The report from the New South Wales inquiry into the bushfires across this year spent some time talking about technology and artificial intelligence, things like drones or unstaffed aircraft,
yes.
It's my hopeless lay terminology, being deployed to situations where it's not safe to send fire investigators into the field. Is that the sort of technology that is also being considered by the research projects that you've just described?
Yeah, that's correct. The RFS conducted a trial last season, albeit it wasn't a busy season compared to previous, but that was involving a medium drone in regional locations that is able to stay up for 8, 9, 10 hours at a time, and in situations as you described, where it may be too dangerous or otherwise inappropriate for other aircraft to be operating. So that trial was conducted last year. That had relatively positive results and will continue this season.
That inquiry was also focused on using drones to try and get to the early identification of fires burning in remote areas within National Parks and Wildlife Service.
Correct.
Same sort of technology involved?
Correct. So that could be a proactive measure or a reactive measure. So you could use them in both settings, yes.
Mr. Fulliger, from your perspective, are there technological advancements in the future that will change the way in which your authorised fire investigators conduct their cause and origin investigations?
Along the lines of what Mr. Millington has described, we also have the ability to call on other agencies to assist with that as well.
What do you mean?
With the use of the drones.
Fire and Rescue New South Wales?
Yeah, national parks and police.
One of the things that Detective Chief Inspector Puffett raised in his evidence yesterday was the possibility of mandating Rural Fire Service reporting to police the presence of fires within RFS districts. by mandating, I understood his evidence to be, he wanted to focus upon ensuring that police are being notified of all fires so that they can determine what, if any, investigation is required to undertake. And he recognised the difficulty in adding an extra burden to brigade levels that might be staffed by volunteers in remote and regional areas, or any area for that matter. Are there ways that the RFS does, in fact, encourage its volunteers or salaried officers to report fires to police, any fire that an appliance has to respond to? Mr. Millington?
Look, most definitely, and unfortunately I'd defer to Mr. Fulliger on this one.
Mr. Fulliger?
Yeah, the agency has, the RFS has the ability to make contact direct with police for police to attend a scene, or we have the ability using the police assistance line to report any fire via that mechanism. That is a responsibility of each district office, and it's a responsibility of a duty officer or staff member to complete that form and submit it to PAL.
So is there a formal requirement, maybe not a mandatory requirement where someone's in trouble if they breach, but is there a formal requirement that your district officers or someone within the Rural Fire Service district should be making sure that those reports go through to police?
Yeah, there is a criteria for that reporting, yes.
One of the things that DCI Puffett referred to was an arrangement in place between Fire and Rescue New South Wales and police where the CAD, the computer aided dispatch for Fire and Rescue, works in with police CAD. And he suggested that although perhaps in its infant stages, there might be opportunities to investigate those sort of technological advances to share information. Are you aware of anything like that, Mr. Millington?
Yes, I am. So, notwithstanding the manual process that's well established that Mr. Fulliger has described, the RFS has implemented a CAD system since the 2019-20 season. So that would certainly be something we could potentially scope to automate that information sharing.
Finally, is there anything further in terms of changes to cause and origin investigations since 2019-2020 that you wanted to bring to Her Honour's attention today? Mr. Millington first.
No, I don't.
Mr. Fulliger?
No, I don't.
Your Honour, those are my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Free, would you like to go last?
Happy to go last, Your Honour, yes.
Just in case something arises. Ms. Rose?
No questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Wilkinson?
No questions, thank you, Your Honour.
Ms. Ransom?
No questions, Your Honour.
Mr. Free?
Thank you, Your Honour. I noticed the time, Your Honour, but there's just two short topics I wanted to raise. Firstly, Mr. Fulliger, to you, I just wanted to ask about existing general practices in relation to cause and origin investigations, and if there is a situation where there's an existing fire and then there's a backburning operation conducted in association with attempts to contain that fire, if the backburning operation itself causes spotting and there's a further fire, is that something that would ordinarily generate a cause and origin investigation?
Not necessarily, because it's a known spot over.
You say not necessarily. There's some circumstances where it would.
If there was suspicion that it may not have been the spot over, the origin and cause investigation may be sought after. Yes.
And do you have any views about whether that kind of scenario ought to be more routinely the subject of a cause and origin investigation?
I'd probably defer to Mr. Millington on that one.
Mr. Millington?
Potentially. Look, as Mr. Fulliger said, in some instances it's clear that the spot over was the ignition source, but there may be the opportunity to provide more formal advice or criteria around that setting.
Thank you. And Mr. Millington, you were asked some questions about the fire progression maps, and I think you explained that they're produced by a part of the RFS, which is the Fire Prediction Unit. Is that right?
That's correct.
The people in the Fire Prediction Unit, are they part of IMTs?
So each IMT has a fire behaviour analyst who's providing the predictions at the time to provide that intelligence, so decisions can be made based on where the fire is going. The progression reports is an activity that occurs after the fire has been contained and somewhat, declared out.
And so if you're dealing with the suggestion that those reports might be generated during the IMT process itself, do you have views about whether that could be done on existing arrangements or whether it would change the arrangements?
It's unlikely that they would be able to be generated within the IMT. That is something that takes, weeks, if not months, to analyse and source the data and do the work that needs to be done. And generally, the IMT, may operate for a number of days after the fire is contained and declared out. That's certainly a body of work that would generally occur after the fact.
Thank you. Nothing further. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. Nothing arising, Ms Ward.
Just two questions, Your Honour. Just coming back to the Gross Valley fire and accepting that you're not necessarily going to conduct a cause and origin investigation into every spot over. At the conclusion of the cause and origin investigation that was conducted for the Gross Valley fire, the investigation report recorded it was determined that the Gross Valley fire was a continuation of the Gospers fire, and the cause and origin of the fire would be in the Gospers fire report. Isn't it important for the authorised fire investigator in this circumstance to acknowledge within the report that the fire that commenced to the west of Mount Wilson Road and ultimately took on the name of the Gross Valley fire was not a continuation of the Gospers fire, but in fact the unintended result of a spot over from a backburn? Mr. Fullagar?
As the backburn was being undertaken for the suppression of the Gospers Mountain fire, it would be deemed as that was part of the Gospers Mountain fire. But the report probably should have had in it that there was backburning operations that had been undertaken.
And Mr. Millington?
Look, I agree with that advice tendered by Mr. Fuller.
It's important for the reader of this report to have an accurate understanding of what was going on at the scene, and that includes the fact that the backburn is a strategic response to a fire burning to the north at Gospers Mountain. But it also includes the fact that there's this unintended consequence of a backfire that introduces fire, that leads to the immediate consequence to communities around Mount Tomah and Mount Wilson and the like. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Mr. Fullagar?
Yes.
Those are my questions, Your Honour.
Thank you, Ms Ward. I think that brings us to the end of the evidence today.
It does.
So we will adjourn and resume at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Stand. Current